Hello YouTube. I haven't made or posted a video for quite some time, and I thought that this would be an appropriate time after this fairly god-awful year that the world has suffered, 2020. At the end of the year, I thought I would like to post something that might be helpful. I am doing this in response to a situation with a young patient of mine, and I had committed myself to making a short series of videos to explain a particular technique. I'll get to the technique just now, and I thought that, well, this is a good opportunity to provide some more information and some more thought on this particular technique. The specific technique that I will be talking about or discussing today will be the practice or the approach of systematic desensitization. This is a very well-known, well-used technique that came from mostly sort of the era of behaviorism, still fairly widely used in cognitive behavioral therapy circles. Elsewhere, if you have followed my videos, you would have heard me say, I can't recall when, where exactly, but I describe myself as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. So somebody who tries to pay attention to unconscious processes, unconscious manifestations, thinking of symptoms as something that is more likely than not to carry more significant meaning than just the surface level would suggest. So, you may well ask yourself, why would a psychodynamic psychotherapist discuss something like systematic desensitization? Like I have also said in previous videos or writings, I think many people are not likely to get to therapy, are not likely to enter into a long-term psychodynamic kind of psychotherapy, and that is, of course, everybody's right, and it might not be the right thing for everybody. And that doesn't mean that people don't still struggle with things, and that as psychologists or therapists we can't provide them with useful ideas. And something like systematic desensitization is a easy to understand technique and easy to utilize, or relatively so. Doesn't rely too much on the assistance of, or doesn't have to rely on the assistance of somebody else. And I think it is something that can provide people with a greater sense of control. So the typical example or the typical situation where one would utilize something like this systematic desensitization is where there is a phobic response, so a fearful response to a particular context or situation or object or stimulus. So the approach, as the name suggests, is that one would then systematically, you would introduce some form of system. You would go about desensitizing, so making it less and less bad, less and less anxiety provoking, fear provoking for the person, until they are in a place or position where they can adequately or completely be in the original situation or in the presence of the object or stimulus without being overwhelmed by fear, or maybe even having a fairly positive kind of response to that self-same stimulus. To illustrate this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation of my patient, and obviously for reasons of confidentiality there is a lot that I will leave out. Her problem is that she is still a teen and she's still at school, and the problem that she faces at the moment is that she is struggling with the experience of public speaking, that she has become quite phobic or so anxious that she performs very badly in situations where she is required for academic reasons to do public speaking. And this was not the case earlier on in her life. Now, what makes this such a useful example is that it also at the same time illustrates how something that might seem like a simple fear can have fairly deep-rooted causes, or at least contributing factors. So her problem started for her when she had to, outside of school, speak at an event that was emotionally very loaded. It was obviously a different context than the one that she was familiar with, so not a school situation, or not faced with people that she knew very well, or with the kind of expectations that one grows accustomed to at school. And it was a situation in which she herself was confronted with tremendous loss. And she herself was essentially in a state of grief. So immediately we can see how something that might appear fairly simple on the surface, there's already more depth and more complexity. So there was potentially an originating event where her levels of anxiety went so high that it became associated with the act of public speaking, and then generalized to other situations where she had to speak in public. But there is this, so it's not only the originating event that one could, I think, describe as traumatic, or having a level of trauma at least, but the other difficult emotions that also accompany that particular situation. I'm not going to go into that because that will divulge too much of her private experience. But I would like to say that it's fairly obvious that her own grief was not a simple, straightforward type of loss, or associated with a straightforward kind of loss, but there was also ambivalence. So there are levels beyond and below even that originating event. Anyway, so I will be using her situation as an example to explain how to go about using how one might use systematic desensitization as an approach. And I'll start with the procedure in the next video. I would like to maybe also just mention a couple of principles that I think are really useful and that are applicable even if one is not using this particular technique. I think that the first principle is that one has to be willing to deliberately and consciously engage with the things that evoke fear. I think this is something that most people at least intuitively understand, but at the same time, because avoidance is such an omnipresent defense mechanism, we find all kinds of ways to avoid engaging with the things that cause great difficulty for us. Yet this technique is focused on doing exactly that. You have to deliberately think about, plan, and execute things in response to the thing that causes fear. So one very deliberately and consciously works with fear. Now, of course, that principle is applicable to a great many other situations, but it remains a very valuable psychological growth oriented idea. The second principle that I think is particularly useful here is that one takes an experience that seems unified, and you deliberately break it down into smaller bits. So you chunk down, as this expression goes, into smaller and more manageable parts. And this is generally a very useful approach. And again, we understand this clearly. This is how most education systems are built, where you start with something simple, and then there's scaffolding in the educational process where you build on that, and it becomes more and more complex as you go along. So and I think this is true for any type of learning. But very often when we are faced with difficult experiences or situations, we have a natural tendency to regard it as unified, um, and it and sometimes it really can be difficult to break it down into smaller parts. But as a problem-solving mechanism or idea, this is very solid, very useful. So another principle: breaking bigger problems down into smaller, more manageable units. While not exactly a principle, I would also like to add that many life experiences can have psychodynamic effects. So when we confront fear and anxiety on one level, of course, we become somewhat different, and sometimes that change can generalize, and we can become, I wouldn't say completely different, but different on many more levels than might have seemed likely initially. So even using something like that is a very strongly behavioral technique is potentially at least likely to lead to psychodynamic shifts, especially in a case like this where the person using it is a young person, and where they essentially use their minds and their courage to confront things that are difficult. And if that can become part of a person's self-referential system or identity, I think that is particularly useful. All right, so in the next video we will launch into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of the technique, and I will use this young woman's situation as a springboard. Of course, it can be used for many different situations or things where people experience fear or anxiety, and it's not limited only to the experience of being afraid of public speaking. Anyway, I hope that you will enjoy this short series and that you will find it useful, helpful, and I will return soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.